Yeah, I wanted to talk with my fellow white guys today to talk about the Iraq War, what it's meant for Iraq, what it's meant for people in the West, and how it has really defined a generation, my generation, the old millennials, I guess. This was a kind of political baptism for us. And of course, who better to discuss this with than the one, the only C. Derek Vaughan, who himself was profoundly shaped by the Iraq War.
I mean, I didn't fight in it, but uh, my brother-in-law did. Um, my uh, a, a close friend of my family who literally lived with me at multiple points before the Iraq War did, and I taught at my first teaching gig. My very first teaching gig was a tutoring gig at the Georgia Military Academy. So all my students did. Um, it was literally pretty much the only way out of my community other than getting into a good college, and getting into a good college from my community was pretty hard because our schools were ranked mid-tier, better than a lot of the surrounding schools, but there you go. And so a lot of the people I dealt with when I was in college, who were just a little younger than me, that was their way out, and I knew a ton of people. We lost people to it. It was kind of the fundamental political thing I engaged with, and my every no matter how my politics has changed in 22 years, and I say 22 years because I really kind of start this build up in 99 with Clinton bombing too. We should probably put him in hell as well. But the war was started formally by George W. Bush. Um, uh, and I feel like for no, yeah, 22 years of my life, I've been devoted to opposing either the war or the results of the war of terror, the political crises that have been defined from it and in its terms. Um, and I see what happened in Syria, what happened in Yemen, all of which directly touched my life much later. Um, from living there, from dealing with Syrian uh, refugees who lived in Egypt and Turkey, and dealing with Yemen refugees. I even taught a few from both those groups, a few students from both those groups when I lived there. Uh, you know, and Palestine. There's all kinds of, but I tie all of that to what happened in the late '90s and early aughts, just before and during the Iraq War. Um, so, in many ways, it is the defining event of my political life. Even more than the recession in '07, and even more than Occupy, or before that, even more than the Battle for Seattle. It was responding to the long and a bit, and for most of its time, almost forgotten. I mean, for the it felt like in 2006 that or even and during the early Obama years that people just forgot we were even at war. It's a pretty defining thing in my life. So different side of it than you, obviously, but um, it's a pretty big deal, and it feels almost absurd that it is still so relevant, because I think it is relevant in ways that even say Vietnam to baby boomers and older Gen Xers. Uh, I think in some ways uh,
American
it was
troops,
worse.
American troops are still in Iraq to this day. So the dreams that the Bush administration had for a short war really have proven to be utterly deluded in the light of history. But let's start with that. Let's talk about the Iraq War and the origins of the Iraq War. So, Vaughn, from your position in the United States, what do you see as being the causes of the Iraq War?
I tend to see it as a mixture of geopolitical complications that really deal with partly from blowback from the US's role in the Iran-Iraq war. I see it as tied to geopolitical implications of trying to establish an emergency regime opportunistically after 9/11 and needing a state of which you could act out against. And they picked one that really didn't have much to do with it, but that neither here nor there after Afghanistan. And I see it as tied to being pushed for by American oil speculators, not oil extractivists. I don't think that's actually what happened. And also defense contract speculators. I mean, so all those interests kind of congealed at once. I don't see it as a singular causal thing. I can't, it's not just blood for oil. It's not just a scapegoat for 9/11. It's not just blowback from the Iraq-Iran war, or it's not just, I mean, I remember liberals like, oh, it's just Bush trying to get revenge for his daddy in Gulf War I. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. But I don't have a unicausal reading of what it is, nor do I think that like it was the sole rupture that like made it's what made the Middle East alone into this contested field of empire, that it had been a contested field of empire going all the way back, to the 1950s. And that's after it was decolonialized. So, I mean, like, if we want to really go into it, I can go back to like, well, the maps were drawn poorly by the British, and like, no one really figured out how to handle shit after the Ottomans went away. I mean, like, there's, how far back do you want to go? Because they're all causal, but it seems to me that any attempt to say that there's just one cause of it, is going to be too simple. What about you, Gene? I mean, it touches you in a very real way.
I mean, I see this as, obviously all of the material interests that propelled the war machine, both the both the initial push to war and also sustained it following the end of hostilities, quote unquote, all the way through the occupation. Obviously those are real factors that helped push forward and sustain that conflict. But I guess my meta narrative for this was that this was an ideological war. And what I mean by that is I take the neoconservative rationale for the war as, I take it seriously. I see this as a product of the end of the Cold War and a shift away from the kind of realist diplomatic posture of the United States, which I would say probably peaked during the 1970s under Nixon, and towards this first more aggressive form of Cold War under Reagan, and then the end of history movement, where elites in the United States, buoyed by their victory in the Cold War, truly believed that they could reshape the world according to their whims and desires. So I see this as being, obviously having material basis. I don't think anyone would have been that interested in invading Iraq if there had been no oil there. But I think as you rightly point out, the extractivist argument is a little weak, especially in light of the, post invasion history of the Iraqi oil industry. I think there were multiple groups pushing for this war. You had Iraqi opposition groups. You had, different countries' lobbies. But I think the neoconservatives who drove this agenda were selling an ideological project where they believed that they could remake Iraq in their own image. And this profound delusion is what drove that war. Because a realist approach, would have been somewhat different. I think the injection of ideology into the American project following the end of the Cold War, I think we see this developing in the 90s, and this is really the culmination of that end of history moment where we have this notion where the United States can impose its Washington consensus on other countries. And Iraq became that kind of collateral damage of that American hubris. It was not simply cynical economic factors driving this war, but a profoundly dangerous delusion of the American ruling class.